let's jump into this deep dive. We're taking a look at the Eager Street development project in Baltimore.
Uh-huh.
And specifically, we've got these meeting minutes from April 2019. So, pretty critical moment, it seems like, in this huge neighborhood revitalization project that they were trying to do.
Yeah, and it's, I think, a really good example of kind of the challenges and the tensions that come up when you have these really ambitious projects. We're talking about a neighborhood that had a 70% vacancy rate.
Wow.
So, a massive undertaking to try to bring it back to life.
It is. And they weren't just like rehabbing a few houses here and there. It was this idea of transforming an entire community,
Right.
attracting new homeowners. And it wasn't just, hey, come buy a house. It was, hey, come buy into this vision of what this neighborhood could be.
Yeah. And it seemed like it was working, at least initially. I mean, they were attracting buyers to this area that had been, struggling for years. Those first few homes that sold, they really did set a new benchmark for property values.
So like a proof of concept.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about Ted Rouse, because he seems to be like a pretty central figure here. And reading through these minutes, you definitely get the sense that he was incredibly passionate about neighborhood revitalization. He saw the potential in this area. He wanted to create something special, something more than just like your typical development project.
Yeah, I mean, I think that passion comes through really clearly. But, I wonder if that passion also led to maybe some unrealistic expectations.
Yeah.
Was there enough attention paid to those details, those practical things, that ultimately determine whether homeowners are satisfied?
Right. And the meeting minutes definitely reveal that he's starting to grapple with these homeowner complaints.
Mm-hmm.
People who are coming back and saying, hey, the construction quality isn't what we expected. And he's not necessarily dismissing their concerns, but he is pushing back a little bit and emphasizing the bigger picture. All of the value that the project has brought to the neighborhood as a whole, things like facade improvements, energy upgrades on surrounding homes, investments that went beyond the individual properties. He seems to be saying, look, you benefited from the community uplift, even if your own home isn't perfect.
It's that tension between the collective good and individual expectations.
Right.
And it gets more complicated when you factor in how they finance this whole thing.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because the project relied pretty heavily on these tax credits to make the homes affordable,
Mm-hmm.
which allowed them to sell at below market prices, which was, essential to get people to buy in this area.
Right, right. The tax credit system, I mean, it's sort of like this carefully balanced ecosystem. You've got developers who need those credits to make the projects financially viable, and then homeowners who are benefiting from the affordability they create. But when that balance gets disrupted, things can get messy.
And that's exactly what Rouse was worried about.
Yeah.
Like, he expresses concern that, if homeowners start reneging on the tax credit agreements, it could undermine the whole system, make it harder to get funding for future projects, sort of this ripple effect.
Yeah. And it shows that inherent risk that comes with public-private partnerships like this.
Yeah.
You've got all these stakeholders with different priorities, different levels of understanding.
Now, there's also Sandy, the developer, and he had a lot of experience with similar projects.
Yeah.
So he came in understanding the challenge of selling this community concept with these base prices. Not a lot of room for customization.
Yeah, I mean, he really emphasizes that need for clear communication, managing expectations from the beginning.
Right.
He talks about websites, community gatherings, really trying to get everyone on the same page. But was that enough?
That's what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
And he also points out that a lot of these buyers were first-time homeowners, so they might not have had the experience to know the difference between a real construction defect and just a regular maintenance issue.
Which makes me wonder, should developers, should community organizations be doing more to support those homeowners?
Yeah.
Maybe even some kind of homeowner education program to help people navigate these complexities? Is just post-move-in counseling enough?
It's interesting you bring that up, because he does mention post-moving counseling.
Okay.
He talks about it as a lesson learned from other projects.
Interesting.
But is that just a reactive thing? Like, oh, we got to do this to kind of clean up the mess? Or is it truly proactive, equipping people with the tools they need to avoid some of these problems in the first place?
Yeah. Good question.
And just to be fair, Sandy does emphasize that the overwhelming majority of homeowners were actually satisfied. They've turned over their tax credits, they're happy with their homes, they're happy with the community improvements. It's really this group, represented by 5 homeowners in these meeting minutes, who are raising these concerns.
Which brings us back to that tension between the individual and the collective.
Mhm.
How do you address those individual grievances without derailing this whole project?
Yeah. How do you find a path forward that satisfies, both the letter and the spirit of the agreement?
Right.
And that's what the meeting seems to be all about.
Okay.
Like they're shifting from defending positions to actually trying to find some practical solutions,
Mhm.
figuring out how to address those concerns while still, keeping the project on track.
Trying to put out a fire without burning the whole house down.
Exactly. They're dealing with these competing interests, they've got limited resources, and they really got to find something that works for everyone, ideally.
Right, right.
Now, before we get into the specifics of their solutions, I want to highlight something that Shannon Sneed said. She was representing the homeowners in this meeting. She made a really interesting point. She said, for these homeowners, the priority isn't necessarily about fighting the tax credit. It's about getting their homes fixed.
So it reframes the problem, right? It's
Exactly.
not just a financial dispute. It's a practical matter of let's get these houses fixed.
Exactly. And that sets the stage for what's going to be a pretty delicate negotiation, a search for a solution that addresses the immediate needs of the homeowners while ensuring the long-term success of this Eager Street project. And we're going to see how that all plays out when we dive into part 2 of this deep dive.
So they really are facing this challenge of like how to get these repairs done. It's not just about like figuring out what's wrong. It's like who's responsible and who's
Yeah.
going to pay for it. That's where it gets kind of tricky.
Yeah. I mean, the minute show, there was some debate about whether it was really fair to ask the developer and contractor to cover the costs, especially since the homeowners hadn't actually fulfilled their financial obligation, right?
Wow.
Like they hadn't turned over those tax credits yet.
Yeah.
It was like a, you get fixed homes, we get the credits kind of deal.
Right. It kind of highlights, that sort of transactional nature of these agreements. Like we talk about buying a house as this like big emotional decision.
Right.
But when you throw in all these complex financial mechanisms, these tax credits and things, it becomes a lot less about the dream home and a lot more about like fulfilling these contractual obligations.
And then to make it even more complicated,
Yeah.
the minutes show that some of these homes were still under warranty
Oh, wow.
and some weren't.
Oh, okay.
So now you've got this whole other layer of like who's responsible, what's covered.
Can you imagine being a homeowner in that situation?
Oh,
Like you buy into this vision and then, things aren't what you expected. And now you're trying to like parse through this warranty agreement.
and on top of that, you've got the homeowner frustration. That comes through really clearly in these minutes
Right.
over past repair experiences. They felt like they weren't being taken seriously before. And so that definitely created this lack of trust going into this meeting.
Yeah. It's like if you've had a negative experience in the past,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be a lot more skeptical going forward. So how do you bridge that gap?
Well, they lay out a few key steps in these minutes. The first thing they agree to do is put the outstanding tax credits in escrow. So kind of like
Yeah.
a show of good faith.
Yeah, it's like hitting pause on the financial side of things while they figure out the practical stuff.
Right. And then they decide to meet with the homeowners again, but this time to kind of re-articulate that original vision of the project.
Yeah.
Almost like a reminder, like,
Mhm.
hey, let's remember why we all embarked on this journey together.
Yeah. I wonder if that's enough though. Like is just restating the vision enough to address these tangible concerns they have.
Right. And that's where the third step comes in. They agree to bring in an independent project manager to assess the scope of the repairs.
Okay. So that brings in some objectivity.
Exactly.
Like an expert who's not on either side.
Someone that everybody can agree on. And, they even had this report from KMA, which was like an outside firm
Oh, okay.
that had done some assessment of, I think it was 5 of the homeowners.
So they had like a starting point?
Exactly. So at least there's some documentation, some shared understanding of at least some of the issues.
Mm-hmm.
And they talk about this idea of a punch-out team,
Okay.
which was basically a dedicated crew that would just go house to house, systematically resolving all of these outstanding issues. So, trying to be thorough and efficient.
At least it gives the homeowners like a timeline,
Mm-hmm.
a point of contact.
And a sense of accountability, too. But, it all comes back to that trust issue for me.
Even with the punch-out team, the independent project manager, how do you guarantee those repairs are actually done right and that the homeowners feel heard?
It really is about more than just like fixing the houses, right? It's about creating that sense of ownership, that feeling that everyone's voice matters in this process.
And I think that's what makes these meeting minutes so fascinating. It's not just like a dry record of decisions.
Hmm.
It really is a window into the complexities of this whole community development process.
It's messy, it's human,
Yeah.
and it really forces us to ask these tough questions about, like, who's accountable, how do we make things transparent, and how do we balance those individual needs with the collective goals?
It really is a balancing act, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to fix these immediate problems while also making sure this whole Igor Street project doesn't fall apart. Yeah, and I think it raises a really important question about community development in general, you know?
Hmm.
How do you balance those big ambitions with actual accountability? You've got this vision, you want to revitalize a neighborhood, but you can't forget about the people who are actually living there.
Right. It's not just about the buildings, it's about people's lives, their
Yeah.
hopes for this community.
Exactly. And that's why communication is so important,
Yeah.
making sure people feel heard, like they're part of the process. It's how you build trust.
And we see them trying to do that in these meeting minutes,
Hmm.
moving away from just defending their decisions and towards a more collaborative approach.
Yeah.
Talking about escrow, independent assessments, these punch-out teams, it feels like they're really trying to find a way forward together.
I hope so, but it's definitely not a guarantee. I mean, will these repairs actually be done right? Will putting the tax credits in escrow actually solve the trust issues? You know, what will people think of this whole project going forward?
Yeah, so many questions. And that brings us to the big question for you, our listener. What do you think? What can we learn from what happened on Eaker Street? If you were advising on a project like this, how would you approach it differently?
Would you focus more on communication up front, maybe even some homeowner education?
Right.
Would you build in more ways to get feedback, to hold people accountable? You know, how do you balance getting things done quickly with doing them right, making sure they last?
It's such a complex issue. The Eager Street project really shows us those challenges, but also the potential of community development.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that revitalization, it's not just a one-time thing, it's a process.
And it takes time, you know, it takes open communication and respect and being willing to learn both from the successes and the mistakes.
And the story isn't over, is it? As you keep looking into this case, I really encourage you to think about those questions.
Mm.
How do we create communities that aren't just nice to look at, but are actually fair and equitable for everyone?
That's the real challenge, isn't it?
It is. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.